Well, tonight we're going to do the story of Frank. I'm off to a good start, right? It's the story of Frank Henry Goodyear, who was a Jekyll Island club member and the owner of Goodyear Cottage. We're going to talk about his legacy, business, family, descendants, but first, let me dispel any wrong information. Our Goodyears have nothing to do with the Goodyear Tire Company. Our Goodyears were lumber barons, and from there we'll go. Now imagine it's the late 1840s in western New York, a little town called Cortland. Dr. Bradley Goodyear was a country doctor and living with his wife Esther. By 1849, they had two young sons, Charles Waterhouse and Frank Henry Goodyear, practicing his profession, medicine, to families of modest means, often without any compensation. Dr. Goodyear was not able to provide his sons with educational advantages beyond those available in public schools. The white one-room schoolhouse where they obtained their elementary education was typical of hundreds of others, like you've probably seen if you live anywhere where there are a lot of farmers. You'll find a lot of white little schoolhouses. But let's talk about Frank Goodyear's businesses. Frank was a self-made man who did accumulate great wealth, even if his father didn't. Born in 1849, he had one older brother, Charles. In both of the Goodyear's sons, the urge to do great things could not be satisfied in their little small village. However, both brothers, if you can imagine this, started out working in the local tannery. Now, I have no idea what a tannery did back in the 1800s, but I don't think I need to know, nor do you. Still in his teens, Frank was the first one to leave home. He had an insatiable desire to make money, and coupled with that, Frank had abundant energy, at least at the start, and keen business sense. He started his career as a teacher in the district school where he had attended. He wanted more. With his worldly possessions packed in a small satchel and $100 that his mother gave him, Frank boarded the train for Looneyville. This was a town on the outskirts of Buffalo. And Robert Looney, the founder of the town which bore his name, hired Frank as a bookkeeper, being paid a whopping $35 a month. Robert Looney had several profitable businesses. He had a general store, a feed and grain business. He had vast stores of Pennsylvania timberlands that I didn't put up on that screen because there wasn't that much room, and logging timber and selling ties of cordwood for fuel to the railroads. His business was growing when Frank went to work for him, but Robert Looney was ready to retire. His boss, Frank, tried to convince him that he should continue being just a laborer for a while, but Frank was having none of that. So Robert Looney eventually convinced him that he could take over the business. He mastered the details and was running the businesses while still in his early 20s. And he also found time in September 1871 to marry the boss's daughter, Josephine Looney. A few months later, Josephine's father died, and Frank started purchasing timberlands from his estate. The family relocated to Buffalo, where in 1901, Buffalo hosted the Pan American Exposition. Streets were lit up for the first time in the country thanks to hydroelectric power generated by Niagara Falls, which is very close to Buffalo if you've never been there. Frank started his own business in the coal and lumber trade, subsequently expanding to include large timber tracts that he purchased in Pennsylvania. He bought isolated tracts of hemlock and pine, and they were far from water, but the only way to get fallen trees to the mills was to use his water access that he had purchased. He pioneered the idea of, okay, back up one. See the little tiny print on the bottom? That went with the slide back in the early 1800s. It says the Goodyear Sawmill in Austin, Pennsylvania. You'll see a later copy of something that looks sort of like that, except not really. Concept of building railroads to connect to those busy sawmills was the start of his empire, actually. Frank built the Buffalo and Susquehanna Railway from Wellsville to Buffalo, a distance of 85 miles. In 1907, the railway leased the older railroad, and I guess there's a difference between a railway and a railroad. I don't know what they are, but I'm telling you about them. And the combined system did business as the B&S Railway. The company owned 40 steam locomotives, 32 passenger cars, and over 25 freight cars, so that tells you that they really were not interested in taking people. They were interested in taking things that could be hauled on a freight car. Frank invented this next picture. You have to look very carefully. It's a steam log roller, which is described as a modified steam shovel that could be carried on a rail car. Now, if you look very closely, you can see the rail car on the bottom, and this was something that he envisioned and built, and I have never seen one from any place else, but there you have it. Frank's companies included railways, coal and coke, lumber companies, and even a steamship company's ship, which was aptly named the Frank H. Goodyear. The steamship was built in Lorain, Ohio, and from Ohio it was sent to Buffalo, where a railroad passenger car was built into the spar deck. You know what a spar deck is? I didn't either. It's a thing that goes on top. If this were, I would imagine it's the flat part that you see. He had a spar deck built on top of that for his use. On the morning in 1904, this was after Frank's death. In 1904, the steamship was sold to the Buffalo and Susquehanna Steamship Company. On the morning of May 23, 1910, a heavy fog off the coast of northern Michigan made navigating very difficult. The steamer James B. Wood, filled with iron ore, also had difficulty seeing, and the result was a collision in which the two steamships and 17 of the 22 souls aboard perished. The steamship went down in less than 4 minutes, if you can imagine. Now, 100 years later, they've just found the Henry H. Goodyear on the bottom of Lake Michigan. I'm so excited about this, I can hardly stand myself. This is what was the spar deck that they were talking about, I think. If it isn't, I don't know, so bear with me and go with it. Okay. Frank and Charles, the brothers, started another new business together, Goodyear Lumber Company. Frank was president, and his brother Charles was vice president. Excuse me. Frank cajoled Charles into joining the business because Frank needed help to keep all of the businesses that he was working on the straight and narrow. And besides which, he had some health issues and he wanted some downtime. So he took it upon himself to have his brother in business with him. So in doing that, Charles agreed and resigned his law practice. Charles replaced, does anybody know who this is? Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, he was not part of their company, but when Charles joined the Goodyear companies, Grover Cleveland took his job. Yes, that Grover Cleveland. Meantime, as their companies grew, they moved some of their land holdings south. Has anybody here ever heard of Bogalusa? Oh, good, then you won't know. Oh, good. Okay. There is when they moved south, they're situated on the Mississippi River, northeast of Baton Rouge, and north of New Orleans is Bogalusa, Louisiana. And it was a company town that was built because they they had so much stuff to do there, they had to build a city, for all intents and purposes, so that all of the people that were needed to work there would stay there and not go off and carouse and what have you. So that's Bogalusa. They had, in the early 1900s, they bought thousands of acres of longleaf pine forests in southeastern Louisiana and southwestern Mississippi. The timber furthered their strategy of building railroad spurs to bring wood to the market, because that's where they were lumber barons, you know. In 1902, they chartered the Great Southern Lumber Company and built the first sawmill in Bogalusa. And this, I think, is really that original sawmill. The Goodyear, after they clear-cut all of after they had clear-cut all the virgin pine forest, a program of reforestation began, which I was thrilled to hear about. It was replaced as the city's main industry by a paper mill and a chemical plant under different owners. To this day, Bogalusa's economy continues to revolve around the lumber and paper mills as well as agriculture. The Goodyear Empire fell upon some hard times in the early 1900s after Frank and then Charles died. Now remember the picture I showed you earlier about the sawmill at Austin, Pennsylvania? Well, this is one of them. When they built it, they said it was not ever going to fall apart. It did. It was destroyed by a flood in 1909, even as it had been touted as the dam that could not break at the time it was built. By then, the next generation of some of the Goodyear family members had taken over the businesses. For example, I mean, this is not the good news part of the story, but there are good things about it. For example, the banking firm that financed the railway expansion to Buffalo filed for bankruptcy. Timber operations in Pennsylvania declined. A federal grand jury indicted the railroad for tariff violations. The railway defaulted on a $6 million mortgage in 1910, and the company filed for bankruptcy. This was all after Frank and Charles died, just so we're keeping with the same time frame. Just a quick aside that may interest you. I learned this just recently, so I threw it in. In July 2009, 102 years later, the Western New York Railway Historical Society thought Frank Goodyear should be in its Hall of Fame. So Frank got this kudo. Now, we've talked about Frank's businesses, but let's switch gears for a second and look at a couple of the homes that Frank and Josephine built. Sometimes it's a better, nicer, let's smile thing. Frank and Josephine worked with the Carrera and Hastings architecture firm to build this. That's, by the way, that's Frank and Josephine, in case you couldn't tell. Frank and Josephine worked with the Carrera and Hastings architecture firm to build their mansion in Buffalo in 1903. They created a lovely home about which front page news was sent out wide and far by the Buffalo News. Their name was on the pages of the newspaper as the home was being built. Now I could regale you with stuff up to here about that house, but I promise I'm not going to do that. In fact, we're going to go through these pretty quickly. The first thing that was said about it was the main rooms of the house are unusually large and connected with spacious corridors set in marble. The next one says adjoining the living room are a hall, I guess I need my glasses, with an organ and a reception room only slightly smaller than the living room. The stone on the exterior and interior, like many of the furnishings, was collected by the elder Mr. Goodyear from all parts of the world where he's been. Now this last one, if you have been over to our Goodyear, there is a corner that looks just like that. And it's the same architects. And I just fell in love with that. And I knew had to let you see that. Okay, and then the last photo from the Buffalo house said, and then 1938. In October 1938, the Buffalo News again showcased, this time, the demolition of the Buffalo Goodyear mansion. Because it was no longer feasible to maintain, and because it was too expensive, and because the kids didn't want the house after the parents had died, and one more reason, the Red Cross in Buffalo built a new building and they needed a parking lot. So, back to the plans for the Jekyll Island Goodyear Cottage. In February 1902, Frank, Josephine, and Frank Jr., who was then 12 years old, their youngest and the only son, checked into the Jekyll Island Club for their first visit to Jekyll Island's winter season in an apartment to Sans Souci. They fell in love with Jekyll but had not yet started building their own home, so the first year they stayed in Sans Souci, but they decided with the three of them plus their maid and their valet, it really was crowded. So within a month, Frank was searching for someplace else to live. But he first became a member of the Jekyll Island Club. His membership was supported by Edmund Hayes of Buffalo and his partner, Charles Stewart Maurice. You people, I think, will recognize the Maurice name even if you don't recognize Edmund Hayes. He was approved 3 days later, which was amazing. Jekyll was meant to be a respite for Frank so that he could relax a little bit. But I don't think he ever knew the word relax. He just was, the most of the time he was here, he was talking business with the other members. So apparently he never did relax. He and William Struthers had conversations, and the Struthers were in the Moss Cottage. Frank's hadn't been built yet at that point. But Frank wanted to see where the available Lot 6 was. So he liked the location on the island, the view, the proximity to the club. What's not to like? His potential neighbors at Moss and his architects had just finished his Buffalo home and were available to help with the winter home. So about a month later, now I hope you can see this, Frank did purchase Lot 6 from William Struthers to build his own cottage. Can you see this? Can you tell where Goodyear is? Okay. No action was taken until the next year. In case you're keeping track, this will help you figure out where, when, and how they stayed on Jekyll Island that winter. The next March, the guest register at the club showed Thomas Hastings of Carrera and Hastings, the architects from Buffalo. They came to Jekyll as a guest of Frank's, and a year later, the architects finally gained approval from the executive committee to proceed on the new house. The facade was just pretty much like the one in Buffalo, but on a much smaller scale, much smaller. Early in 1904, as Goodyear Cottage was not yet furnished, the family rented the Hollybourne Cottage from the Maurice family for the season. How many of you have heard the stories about the Maurice family ever letting anybody take over their house and use it and rent it? Didn't happen. It just, Mrs. Maurice was not in that frame of mind. So they stayed 1 year. Next year, they were looking for someplace else. The Goodyear family decided to find somewhere else to stay as their cottage was still not finished for the next 2 seasons. So the Goodyear family stayed at the club cottage those 2 seasons. The Goodyear Cottage was completed in 1906, shortly after the season ended. So they didn't even get to use it that year. I do not know how long other cottages took to be assembled, but apparently in my humble opinion tonight, Goodyear Cottage gets the blue ribbon for perseverance. Very soon after arriving on Jekyll, the Goodyears returned to Buffalo because Frank was unwell and his mother in Buffalo was also ill. On April 10th, she went to Frank's home to visit her son at his bedside, returning to her own home where she died later that day. And I just love this little picture of her. Her name is Esther Kinney Goodyear. Yeah, that's her house. Was her house. 3 weeks later, the Buffalo newspaper gave Frank front page news when he died at the age of 58 of Bright's disease, which is now called kidney disease. His estate held his club share here and his membership for 2 years until Josephine was elected to full membership in 1909. And they were not, I think she had the very first, maybe first, women, she was one of the first women to have a club membership. Thank you. Frank's estate, by the way, was estimated at $10 million.
That was a lot.
It was. It's a lot now. In 1915, Josephine and Frank Jr., who by this time was about 20, still the youngest son, were walking, and her maid, I can't forget the maid, went to the Buffalo train station to take a train to New York City to visit her sister-in-law, Ellen Conger Goodyear. Now, Ellen, you've heard me talk about Frank's brother, Charles. Well, Ellen was his widow. So, as they were walking through the station, Josephine suddenly developed difficulty breathing. The porter caught her and helped her to sit down after a short respite. She felt she wanted to continue the trip because she wanted to go see Ellen. Frank Jr. and the porter helped her up to the door. Before she got to the train, she collapsed again, suffering a major coronary event. Now, this was, at that point, they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have, I don't know how they roused a doctor, but there weren't any doctors hanging out in the where the porters are. So they finally found a physician close by, and Josephine was put into an ambulance. And back then they didn't take them to the ER, they took her home. And she was gone before she arrived home. Now in the meantime, you've heard me talking about young Frank. Well, his fiance was supposed to be meeting her soon-to-be mother-in-law that day. And they both had separate train cars, I guess, for lack of a better word. Anyway, they both had trains that they were going to take to Buffalo. Oblivious to all that was happening, Dot, his fiance, Frank's fiance, was waiting for them in her car on the train. And they didn't tell Dot until after the train had left the station what had happened. So at the very next stop, she had to get out of the train, turn around, and come back to help Frank prepare his mother for her funeral. Dot's father, meantime, I should tell you that Mrs. Goodyear's spot was in the Goodyear Mausoleum, and she was laid to rest there. Dot's father, are you all keeping up with this? Okay. Frank's father, Dot's father, Seymour H. Knox, died a few months before Frank's mother did. His will spelled out that his final resting place was the Knox Mausoleum, but there's just one sticky wicket. It was never built yet. It was in his will that he was going to be there. So, as it worked out, he was placed in a hermetically sealed crypt in the Goodyear Mausoleum until the Knox Mausoleum could be constructed. Shown here are the two family mausoleums next to each other, and immediately next to each other, I should say, at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo. Upon his mother's death, Frank Jr. inherited both his parents' home in Buffalo and Goodyear Cottage in Jekyll Island. He and his family and his sister's families continued to enjoy the Jekyll Island cottage for many more years. Frank Jr. became a Jekyll Island Club member in 1891, and when they were married, Frank and Dot also built their summer home in East Aurora called Knox Farm. Now this palatial little place here that they built has 14,400 square feet on 2 floors, and I think they have somebody on staff who takes care of the 2,270 panes of glass in the building. Now let's switch gears a little bit and get back to Frank Henry Goodyear. Just imagine him, because he's obviously not with us anymore. Lest you should think all he did was work. He was very involved in his hometown of Buffalo. Philanthropy is one way in which he was a primary asset to the city. Even as Frank was working, and you can see this laundry list here of all the companies in which he was working with no pay. This was what he did as philanthropic visions for the city. And known for his philanthropy in his hometown, here's one example. Frank offered a grant of $100,000 to purchase 1,400 zoo animals to build a world-class zoological park in the city of Buffalo. He served on the board, and he personally took 100 people on his own dime to the most prominent citizens, I'm sure, to Cincinnati to see their zoo. Now, I'm from Cincinnati for the last umpty years. Has anybody else?
I've been to the zoo. It's a wonderful.
Well, this is old, but it is a wonderful, wonderful zoo. However, Frank's idea to build the zoo for Buffalo was sent to the legislature. With so many changes, conditions, and requirements were attached to the legislation, the Buffalo Zoological Gardens never took root, sadly. But while we're on philanthropy, let's talk about Josephine Looney Goodyear. The men don't have all the assets. Frank's wife was Josephine, but she was so much more than that. She was also deeply involved in several nonprofit organizations. For example, the next slide may be recognizable to you. The building was known as the Furness Cottage, and the house was moved around on Jekyll Island 3 times, but this is where it's still, I don't think anybody's going to move it again. To memorialize his mother, Frank Goodyear Jr. purchased the house from John J. Albright in December 29 and relocated it to the new location where it still stands at the end of Shell Road. Frank had then deeded it to the newly incorporated Josephine Goodyear Memorial Infirmary. And the point of that was so that if anybody who was here needed medical help, it was available to them. While she was alive, Josephine first founded the Josephine Goodyear Foundation, incorporated in 1913. That's a beautiful picture of her. So don't be offset without seeing all of what she did too. It still is under the original name and still active in the New York jurisdiction under that name. Several years later, Josephine purchased a large tract of land on Main Street in Williamsville, New York, to build and maintain the Josephine Goodyear Convalescent Home and the Memorial Institution for the Care of Children. When complete, the home housed disadvantaged women and children and provided pre-op services. This was before World War I, or II rather, to prepare them for surgery and to provide post-surgery recovery. However, after the World War II, they really didn't need they had the advent of antibiotics, so they didn't need all of those kinds of things. So instead, the nonprofit was begun. They sold the property, got $300,000 for it, and a nonprofit foundation was begun in her name with the $300,000 funding from the property sale. Impressed with the Community Foundation's investment returns, the Goodyear Foundation has, in the last 20 years, transferred their $6 million into a donor-advised fund in the Buffalo Community Foundation. The Goodyear Foundation Board Contribution Committee meets and decides where to give their funds twice a year. So Josephine is still important. And now we're going to switch gears again. I'm keeping on your toes. We're going to talk about the family members, and I promise it's not going to take forever. Before we get too involved, though, with the Goodyear children, here's one of the best family photos I've found. You'll see that Frank's mother on the left is sitting. Frank is behind his mother, and on the right is Josephine with their youngest child, their first and youngest child, Grace. Frank and Josephine had 4 children. This is the first. We'll talk about all 4, but mostly when they were adults. When the last time I talked about Goodyear, I think we talked about the kids who were, here bumping around and what have you. So we're taking it up a notch. Now we're talking about the adults. Grace was their first child and the eldest daughter, and she lived in Switzerland for 5 years because she was recovering from tuberculosis. Grace married her first husband in 1804, had 2 children, and divorced him in 1909. Her children were Ganson Goodyear Depew and Lucia Depew. This is without a doubt 2 of the worst pictures I have ever found, but I'm sorry, it's the best I can do. Her son Ganson was an attorney deeply involved with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, which was approved by Congress in 1914. Ganson never married, and he died in 1924 of appendicitis when he developed peritonitis. Her daughter was married and divorced twice. Grace married her second husband, Captain Ashton Potter, and they married in Colorado Springs. Captain Potter was in the U.S. Army Cavalry. He was a millionaire. He was a globetrotter, and he was known as the Wyoming Cattle King. Apparently, they lived in Wyoming. Her husband was the son of the Bishop of New York, and when Ashton Potter died of a heart attack, Grace's mother, Josephine, took a train and went to stay with Grace to get her through her health issues. The tuberculosis was back. A month later, Grace died at the age of 42 of tuberculosis. Josephine brought Grace back to Buffalo, and her body was interred in the Goodyear Mausoleum. Josephine Goodyear Sicard, the middle daughter, was named for her mother, and this is one of those where I'm not even going to try to tell you who's who, because there's 3 Josephines and 2 Georges, I think. Anyway, the middle daughter was named for her mother, and she married George Sicard in 1900. George was an attorney, and when they married, he went to work in the Goodyear companies. The couple had 2 children, 3-year-old George and a new baby, Josephine. However, Josephine became very ill with typhoid fever a couple months after her daughter was born. Her parents were in Europe trying desperately to get back to be here when she hopefully recovered, and that was not the case. She died at the young age of 29. When his wife died, George Sicard quit working at the Goodyear companies and severed all ties. Now, there's a story that goes with this, and I'll just tell you, I have no indicator other than when I found last week 3 new, that I'd never seen before, censuses. George could not cope with 2 little kids, and I do mean 2 little kids. So he was willing to do anything to get rid of the little kids. Apparently he wasn't a real great dad. In June Hall McCash's book, The Jekyll Island Cottage Colony, she noted Josephine Goodyear had her hands full, but that she was also overseeing the care of her Sicard grandchildren. So Josephine was taking care of the little kids that their dad didn't want to be bothered with. Additional information about the Sicard grandchildren was in the 1910, 20, and 30 censuses that I've just found. In 1910, the children were shown as boarders in the census, and the head of the household was Carl Friedman. Now, in the Jekyll Island Cottage Colony book, it mentions Carl Friedman taking care of the kids. George was 9 years old at that point, and Josephine was 6. 10 years later, the children were in school living with their father. And he had remarried. And he had a new child. And he's shown as being the president of an oil company with 5 servants in the house. So both children had Goodyear in their middle names. Both the kids survived apparently very well. And their daughter Josephine was married and had 2 kids by 1930. So there you have it. It was, you know, it wasn't the gloom and doom that we thought it was going to be. They did get to actually enjoy their family. The third daughter, Florence, was divorced from her first husband, and Florence and her 2 daughters, Grace and Florence, are shown in this picture. Florence married Charles Meldrum Daniels, one of the best known athletes in the country. Daniels was an 8-time Olympic medalist and world record holder in 2 freestyle swimming events, and he invented the American crawl, in case you care. At the 1908 Olympics, he won gold in the 100-meter freestyle. After they married, Florence and Charles had 2 more children. A son, I know you're going to be surprised, his name was Frank Henry Goodyear Daniels, but his nickname was Goody. And a second son, Charles M. Daniels. Now, in this photo are Flossie, Goody, and Grace. Aren't they just cute? Daniels also became a member of the Jekyll Island Club. Finally, Frank and Josephine's only son and last child was Frank Henry Goodyear, Jr. He was studying at Yale until he got married, but he left school to join the family businesses. Frank H. Goodyear, Jr. married Dorothy Virginia Knox, the eldest daughter of Seymour Horace Knox and Grace Millard, in 1915. In searching for photos of the 2, these are the best I could do, and they're passport photos. Oh well. It was said that it was an auspicious wedding anyway, and one that Frank's father would no doubt have approved, as they joined 2 of the most prominent families in Buffalo. You'll recall Dot's father was the one who died before he was in the mausoleum. A few days after the U.S. declared war on Germany in 1917, Frank enlisted in the Naval Air Service, trained in Buffalo, stationed in Pensacola, and after the armistice, he went back to work in the Goodyear companies. Frank enjoyed the good life. He was a good athlete. He played many sports, including tennis, polo, squash, you name it. The land on which the 113-acre summer home, the Knox Farm, is located was originally part of the Knox family. Dot and Frank had sold their first home, Knox Farms, to Seymour, and it is now a state park. Frank and Dot decided to build a more elaborate English country-style summer home with stables, polo fields, bridle paths on 222 acres across the road from the old house. Back to Frank. He was a car guy. His garage included at least 12 cars. Frank, Dot, and 2 couples, including Jekyll Island Club member Vernon Prentice, were on their way to dinner in Frank's Rolls Royce. Frank was driving, and while attempting to pass a slower car, another car coming the opposite direction appeared from nowhere, and the vehicles collided. His vehicle left the road, went into a ditch, overturned, and hit a tree on the driver's side. Dot was able to get out, and a group of men who saw the accident stopped to help remove the car from the tree so that Frank could be removed. Vernon Prentice, future president of the Jekyll Island Club, whose foot was pinned in the wreckage, was not seriously injured. This was before cell phones and any way to call for help. Frank died at the age of 39 in the hospital emergency room. 11 months later, Dot, Frank's widow, with 4 small children, whose names, and I'm not going to ask you to remember these, but I'll just tell you what they are. Dot, Marjorie, Frank, and Bobby were their kids. She married the Jekyll Island Club member Edmund Rogers, who actually was, when she was staying at Goodyear Cottage, he was next door at Moss Cottage. He was a widower, 2 kids. She was a widow, 4 kids. You do the math. Dot found the house, because Frank died before they could finish the house. She found that new house that they were going to build, that 222 acres or whatever it was. Anyway, she thought that she really wanted not to live there. So she had a discussion with the kids, and the family decision was that it would be made into a golf course and housing development. Thus, acreage was set aside for Craigburn Golf Course, designed by Robert Trent Jones, and the stable became the clubhouse. Additional acres were developed for the home sites. Now, in this next picture, Dorothy Knox Goodyear Rogers is pictured at the left with somebody said a famed golfer, Bobby Knowles, if anybody here is a golfer and knows that name. And then Bing Crosby was on the other side. I promised to focus on one of the next generations, and I've narrowed it down. It's only 2 more paragraphs, so bear with me. I promised, since we spent most of the time with Frank and Dot and their 4 children, you might as well meet one of them. While some are interesting, there's some of the kids that I wouldn't bother you with. But Frank and Dot's son, Bobby, or Robert Goodyear, was born in Buffalo. He graduated from the Groton School and served as a navigator with the 8th Air Force in World War II. After the war, Bobby attended Yale University, graduating in the class of 1949 with a degree in economics. Bobby was a pitcher, or a right fielder, whatever they needed him to be, on the Yale baseball team, playing for Yale in the College World Series in 47 and 48. On the baseball team was his good friend with whom he remained lifelong friends, George H.W. Bush, the 41st president. George Bush, who was then the captain of the Yale baseball team, in this photo, George H.W. was shown receiving the manuscript of Babe Ruth's autobiography, which Babe Ruth was donating to Yale. In 1951, Bobby moved to Aiken, South Carolina, where he purchased Longleaf Plantation. Bobby was an avid golfer, a longtime member of the Augusta National Course, and played every opportunity he got. In addition to playing golf, Bobby was involved in golf course development, and with his principal project being Craigburn Golf Club in East Aurora, which was his mother's idea. It was designed by Robert Trent Jones too, and it was built on his mother's estate on her land. Bobby had a low handicap in 1952, and he won the Palmetto Golf Club's annual Pro-Am with Ben Hogan as his partner, shooting a best ball of 61. Bobby lived in Aiken until his death at 83 years of age. Now, there were others that I could go, how much time? What time is breakfast? I mean, I could stand up here and talk to you till you're blue in the face, but I don't think that would be in your best interest or mine. So thank you very much. If anybody has questions, I'm here.